Hello again, it's Alan Macon, the local history tutor from Knowsley Face, with a continuing series of short history videos on the local history of Knowsley and Liverpool. Today's short video will look at the history of the so-called Liverpool Overhead Railway, fondly remembered on Merseyside as the so-called Dockers Umbrella. We'll look at various maps as the one in front of you, its development from 1893 when it first opened to its closure and its demolition in 1957, a period of over 60 years. Look at lots of old photographs of the overhead railway and the docks in the background, how it was advertised at one point as a tourist attraction, how it developed, became hugely popular between the wars but declined rapidly after the Second World War. We will also look at the interior of the so-called carriages and its first, second, third class passengers. And now in the 21st century there have been attempts to develop a modern light railway sometime in the 21st century. So in front of you can see quite clearly a lovely map entitled the Liverpool Overhead Railway. If I zoom in, the journey was some 6.5 miles long from the Dingle in the south of Liverpool, which was underground. Passengers had to get off at Herculaneum, travelled north if you were going north towards James Street, the Pier Head, Prince's Dock, Alexander Dock, Gladstone Dock, and heading north you got off at Seaforth Sands. If you wish to continue your journey, you got on a normal train, so to speak, and would head for Southport or other parts of Lancashire. So that's the Liverpool Overhead Railway map from the early 20th century. If we continue the theme, the Liverpool Overhead Railway opened in 1893, the late Victorian period, designed by two famous engineers of the time, Sir Douglas Fox and James Greathead. The overhead was the world's first electric elevated railway and the first to be protected by electric automatic signals, revolutionary in its day. The line ran from the Dingle to Seaforth, 6.5 miles. At its peak between the 20s and 1930s, 20 million people used the overhead railway. As I've said before, very popular with tourists. The line would become 6 miles long, and the advertising of the time advised people to view the best docks in the world. Liverpool at the time, the docks was booming, and it was known as the gateway to the empire. So the pier, this is a nice photograph from about 1920 of the pier head with the elevated railway in the background. The dock road full of carts, the poor horses carrying huge amounts of weight, and all the cobbled streets of Liverpool towards the pier head there, and the pier head in 1920. I mentioned about advertising, so this is a lovely advertising poster entitled A Round Trip to see the finest docks in the world and the giant ocean liners. So this is to attract particularly tourists to travel from the south end and the north end and to view the growth of the docks, which at the time were being very busy and full of ships from all over the empire. If you continue the theme of photographs, the top photographs entitled Looking Towards the Three Graces, the bottom one's entitled Prince's Dock 1940s. So this is Looking Towards the Three Graces. The Three Graces you can see in the background. The first of the Three Graces is the Port of Liverpool building. The middle building is the Cunard building, and the last building in the background with the clock on it, arguably Liverpool's most famous building, the Liver building, all built just before and during the First World War. And in the background is the Strand. On the very far end is the docks towards James Street in the background. Most of these buildings on the right hand side have nearly all been demolished. So that's towards the pier head in 1910, and then the Three Graces. Below that is the Prince's Dock, just north of the pier head. This was a view from the 1940s, the so-called dock estate with the overhead railway in the background. All these buildings in the background, warehouses, all were demolished in the 1950s, 1960s. On this site today, as we look at it, 4-star hotels, some lovely apartments. So it's a very quite affluent part of Liverpool now. It's greatly changed to what it was even 20, 15 years ago. Huge amount of investment have gone into this part of Liverpool. So that's taken from the 1940s. We continue the history. So by 1902, the Edwardian period, the journey, some 6 miles or so, end to end, was some 22 minutes and would become very popular with tourists. So this is the interior view of the carriages, taken in the 40s, 1950s. Looking at the clothing at the time. So there was first, second, third class carriages. Third class were often kept for the dockers who were in their work clothes coming on and off the docks, and most dockers smoked, so these cabins would have been full of smoke. Rather unhealthy, I'm afraid. The bottom one, again from probably 1940s, 1950s, just a basic construction, all made out of wood and glass. Very basic construction by modern standards. We continue. This is another two illustrations of two maps. The top one is around 1900. There's the famous St Nicholas Church in the background with Pierhead Station, and underneath it says, looking northeast towards the Pierhead Station, the early 1900s, at this time before the Liver building was built, which was 1911. A good view of the station was possible. The bottom one is an illustration taken from the Liverpool Museum by the Pierhead. One carriage was saved and then it's ended up in a museum, and it's been revamped over the years. So these are just models, not real people, these are models. But you can, what it nicely shows, what it nicely illustrates, just made out of very basic wood, and this was still in existence till 1956, 57. So we continue the theme of the overhead railway. So the overhead railway suffered damage during the war, Second World War, and in 1948 it was not nationalised, being a local railway but with an urgent need of repair, and the increased use of the car would mean a big drop in passenger numbers. So they dropped well below the 20 million between the wars. The railway ran on iron girders, which were vulnerable to corrosion. Little steam engines ran underneath, running between each dock. So after the war, the company that ran it, private company, needed £2 million for maintenance costs. They asked the corporation to help them out. They said they didn't have the money because of the problems of the after the war, late 1940s, early 1950s. So they tried to raise £2 million, couldn't get the money, so they decided to close the line down. Despite public protest, the line was closed on the 30th of December 1956. Demolition of the structure commenced in September 1957. An original carriage was kept by the Museum of Liverpool, and you've just seen an illustration of it. Some 15 to 20 years ago, plans were made to bring a light railway, so-called light railway, modern railway, to Liverpool. 3 routes were envisaged to run from the Albert Dock to Kirkby, another line to run from the Albert Dock to Edge Hill, and another line to run eventually from the Albert Dock to Liverpool Airport. Lack of funding stopped it dead in its tracks, so to speak. Lastly, I would just like to show you a photograph, 2 photographs. The top one is an illustration of looking down. Probably this photograph must have been taken, I would say, from Liverpool's St Nicholas Church, looking down towards the Pierhead with the Liver building in the background. And the second photograph is a nice illustration taken from 1957 of the process of demolition from September 1950 on, with this St Nicholas Church in the background. So you can see there's workmen, or there would have been workmen, taking all these iron girders down. Most of it was taken to Kirkby, and it was dismantled and destroyed in Kirkby back in 1957. Right, as usual, I'd like to finish there. Please make any comments you wish, as usual, and please stay tuned to Knowsley Face and Knowsley Recovery websites for any tips on mental health and well-being. Thank you.